On February 8, 2007, in a conference room in Midtown Manhattan, a stack of documents sat on a polished table. The signatures took hours. By the time the last pen was capped, 590 office buildings across the United States, glass towers in Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, New York, steel and concrete blocks in Atlanta and Dallas, 105 million square feet of American commercial real estate had changed hands. The price was $39 billion. The seller was a 75-year-old man from Chicago named Sam Zell, and when he walked out of that room, he had just completed the largest leveraged real estate sale in American history. 18 months later, commercial real estate values in the United States dropped by roughly 40%. The buyers were underwater. Lehman Brothers was dead. The global financial system was cracking open, and Sam Zell had already cashed the check. If the story ended there, you could call it the greatest single asset sale of the 21st century. But it does not end there, because 10 months after selling those 590 buildings, at the exact peak of the market, the same man bought a newspaper empire for $8.2 billion using his employees' retirement savings, and it went bankrupt within a year. That is not a contradiction you can explain away. That is a life. Sam Zell was born on September 28, 1941, in Chicago. His parents, Rutla and Berek Zielonka, were Polish Jews who had left Poland in 1939. According to Zell's own account, they departed weeks before the German invasion, traveling through Japan and arriving in the United States just before he was born. Most of the extended family who stayed behind did not survive the Holocaust. Zell returned to this fact throughout his life, in interviews, in speeches, in the memoir he published in 2017. He did not treat it as background color. He treated it as the foundational lesson of his career. His father had looked at the evidence, concluded that the situation was deteriorating beyond recovery, and acted while others waited for certainty. By the time certainty arrived, it was too late to leave. You can hear that logic running underneath every deal Zell ever made. The majority waits, the minority acts. The difference between the two is not courage. It is the willingness to evaluate evidence without sentiment. He grew up in Chicago, attended the University of Michigan for both undergraduate and law school, and it was there, in Ann Arbor, in the early 1960s, that the entire empire began. Not with a skyscraper, not with a hedge fund, with a small apartment building near campus that a 20-year-old law student bought with his classmate Robert Lurie. Picture it. A 2- or 3-story walk-up, exterior staircases, maybe 12 units, students as tenants, leaky faucets, the two of them collecting rent checks, fixing what they could, hiring out what they couldn't. It was not glamorous. It was not visionary. It was a rental property near a college, and it threw off enough cash that they bought another one. And then another. Lurie handled operations and finance. Zell handled finding the deals and closing them. The partnership would last nearly 3 decades, and it would build the foundation for everything that followed. But we will come back to Lurie. His part of the story deserves more than a passing line. In 1976, Zell published an article in a trade journal called Real Estate Review. The title was The Grave Dancer. In it, he laid out his investment thesis in plain language. The best time to buy real estate is when properties are in distress, when other investors are running, when lenders are desperate to clear their books. He described himself as someone who danced on the graves of other people's failed deals. He did not receive the nickname from critics. He gave it to himself. He was branding the strategy as macabre before anyone else had a chance to. And the timing of that article was not accidental. The United States was just coming out of the brutal 1973 to 1975 recession. The oil embargo, stagflation, interest rates climbing, and a wave of real estate foreclosures that left buildings across the Sun Belt and the Midwest sitting half vacant with owners who could not make their mortgage payments. This is where you have to understand what Zell was actually doing, because the popular version, he buys dead companies, misses the critical distinction. He was not buying dead buildings. He was buying live buildings with dead owners. A building does not stop collecting rent because its developer went bankrupt. The tenants are still there. The leases are still in force. The cash still flows. What broke was the capital structure. The developer had borrowed too much, the interest payments exceeded the income, and the lender wanted out. Zell bought the equity at a fraction of its value, restructured the debt, and waited for the market to recover. The building itself was never the problem. That distinction between an asset that is fundamentally impaired and an asset that is financially distressed is the intellectual core of everything Zell built. Most investors could not make it. When a building is in foreclosure, it looks dead. The lobby is dirty, the parking lot is cracked, the sign out front has missing letters. Every instinct tells you to walk away. Zell walked in. Then came the savings and loan crisis. Between 1986 and 1995, more than 1,000 savings and loan institutions in the United States failed. The total losses reached approximately $160 billion. The federal government created the Resolution Trust Corporation to liquidate the assets of the failed thrifts, and the RTC was selling real estate portfolios at steep discounts because it had no mandate to hold and manage property. It needed the assets off its books. If you had been standing in the office of an RTC liquidation officer in 1990, you would have seen stacks of manila folders on the desk, each one a foreclosed property. Apartment complexes, office buildings, strip malls, the fluorescent lights buzzing, the phone ringing with another bank calling to report another failure. And into this bureaucratic desperation walked Sam Zell with capital and the willingness to use it. When you are the buyer who shows up with cash during a liquidation, you set the terms. Zell was one of the most aggressive buyers during the RTC fire sale. The specific deal terms from this era are not well documented in public records. The purchases were private transactions, and the economics of individual acquisitions remain largely inside the walls of equity group investments. But the pattern is clear from the results. By the early 1990s, Zell and his team controlled a vast portfolio of apartment properties acquired at prices well below replacement cost. In 1993, he took those apartments public. Equity Residential Properties Trust launched with an initial public offering that raised roughly $130 million. But the IPO was not the point. The point was what it enabled. As a publicly traded REIT, Equity Residential could access the equity and debt markets at a scale that no private buyer could match, and the American apartment market was radically fragmented. Thousands of small owners holding individual properties or small clusters. Zell used Equity Residential as a consolidation machine, buying up these fragmented holdings year after year, building the largest publicly traded apartment REIT in the country. At its peak, the portfolio held over 200,000 units across major American cities. Think about that number. 200,000 apartments, 200,000 front doors, working class and middle class units, garden-style walk-ups, not luxury towers, the housing of ordinary Americans aggregated at industrial scale, not glamorous, enormously profitable. If you have ever rented an apartment in a major American city, the structure Zell helped pioneer, the RAD as an operating company rather than a passive holding vehicle, shaped the market you rented in. He did not invent the REIT, but he was among the first to use it as a tool for aggressive consolidation, and the model he built at Equity Residential became the template for an industry. Now, the sale. By the mid-2000s, Zell controlled another colossus, Equity Office Properties Trust, the largest publicly traded office REIT in the United States. 590 buildings, 105 million square feet, office towers in every major metropolitan market in America. In November 2006, the Blackstone Group, led by Stephen Schwarzman, approached with an offer to buy the entire portfolio. But Blackstone was not alone. Vornado Realty Trust, another major real estate firm, entered a competing bid. The two most sophisticated real estate buyers in the world began bidding against each other for the privilege of purchasing Zell's buildings. Zell sat back and let the auction run. The final price, approximately $39 billion, including assumed debt. The deal closed on February 8, 2007. Zell's personal proceeds, depending on how you calculate his equity stake and options, were somewhere between $900 million and $1.5 billion. Here is what makes this sale legendary. The S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index had peaked in mid-2006. The broader commercial real estate market peaked in early to mid-2007. The first tremors of the financial crisis appeared that summer when two Bear Stearns hedge funds loaded with subprime mortgage securities collapsed in June and July. By September 2008, Lehman Brothers was gone, and the entire global financial system was in freefall. Commercial property values cratered by roughly 40% from their peak. Blackstone, the buyer, faced devastating markdowns on the portfolio it had just purchased at full price. Zell had handed them the bag and walked away clean. Was it skill or luck? The honest answer involves both. Zell had been signaling for at least a year that he believed office real estate was fully valued. He was a willing seller. But the Blackstone bid was unsolicited, and the competing offer from Vornado drove the final price above what either buyer had initially intended. Zell did not set the $39 billion number. The market set it for him. His skill was in recognizing that the price exceeded his own assessment of fair value, and not hesitating to take it. He never claimed in any public record that he predicted the 2008 financial crisis. The distinction matters. Selling because you believe prices are high is not the same as selling because you foresee a systemic collapse. And you know this distinction matters because of what he did next. 10 months after closing the greatest real estate sale of the decade, Sam Zell bought the Tribune Company. In December 2007, Zell completed the acquisition of one of the most storied media conglomerates in America. The Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the Baltimore Sun, and dozens of other newspapers and television stations. The deal was valued at approximately $8.2 billion. But the structure of the deal is where the story turns dark. Zell's personal equity investment was roughly $315 million. Less than 4% of the total price. The rest was debt and, critically, the company's own employee stock ownership plan. The ESOP meant that employee retirement savings were used to help finance the acquisition. Tribune workers, reporters, editors, pressmen, advertising staff had their retirement funds concentrated in the stock of a single company that their new owner had just loaded with debt. Less than 12 months later, on December 8, 2008, Tribune Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was one of the largest media bankruptcies in American history. Zell lost his $315 million, a fraction of his net worth. The employees lost their retirement savings. The ESOP holdings became essentially worthless. A federal court later found that the ESOP fiduciaries had not adequately protected employee interests. The structure was legal. Whether it was right is a question the numbers alone cannot answer. And here is the contradiction that no biography of Zell can resolve by choosing a side. The same instinct that made the equity office properties sale brilliant. The willingness to act on conviction when the evidence pointed one direction made the Tribune acquisition disastrous. He applied his distressed buying framework to an industry in secular decline. Newspapers were not temporarily distressed by a broken capital structure. They were fundamentally impaired by the Internet's destruction of their advertising model. For once, the grave dancer confused a dying patient with a sleeping one. The man who had spent 40 years distinguishing between financial distress and fundamental impairment failed to make the distinction when it mattered most. Tribune emerged from bankruptcy in 2012. The newspaper survived in diminished form. The employee losses did not reverse. If you have ever read the Chicago Tribune, if you have ever held that paper in your hands on a Sunday morning, you were holding the work of journalists who covered their own owners' financial engineering, who documented their own retirement savings being restructured into someone else's leveraged bet. The paper's own coverage of the Zell acquisition is one of the more remarkable acts of journalism in recent American media history. There is one part of this story that almost never gets told. Robert Lurie, Zell's partner from those first apartment buildings near the University of Michigan. The man who handled operations while Zell found deals. The man who helped build the foundation of everything. Equity residential, equity office properties, equity group investments, the entire architecture of the empire. Lurie died of cancer in 1990. Zell continued alone for the next 33 years. He never took another partner of that kind, but he named the Zell-Lurie Real Estate Center at the Wharton School after both of them. It is the only major public monument to the partnership that started with a rental house near a college campus. Every empire has a co-founder the legend forgets. Lurie was Zell's. Beyond real estate, Zell invested across sectors. J-Core Communications, a radio broadcasting company he sold to Clear Channel in 1999. Ventures in Brazil, Mexico, India, Colombia. He argued that the same dynamics he had exploited in the United States, distressed sellers, fragmented markets, recoverable assets, existed on a larger scale in developing economies. Equity group investments became a platform for contrarian bets across industries and continents. And through all of it, Zell presented himself in a way that contradicted every expectation of what a billionaire should look like. He rode motorcycles. He wore leather jackets to investor conferences. He used profanity freely in public settings. The image was deliberate. The outsider who refused to dress like the establishment even after he had become it. Whether the persona was authentic or performed is unknowable from the outside. Probably both. Sam Zell died on May 18, 2023. He was 81 years old. Forbes estimated his net worth at approximately $5.2 billion. His parents left Poland in 1939 to survive. He spent his entire career walking toward what others ran from. Distressed buildings, bankrupt companies, broken capital structures, the wreckage that institutions needed to clear from their balance sheets. He built a fortune on the principle that the biggest risk is not acting when the evidence tells you to move. But the Tribune bankruptcy sits in the record alongside the equity office properties sale, and neither cancels the other. He was not infallible. He was not a prophet. He was an investor with a specific temperament and a specific thesis who was right far more often than he was wrong. And when he was wrong, other people paid the heavier price. The next time you walk past a glass office tower in any major American city, consider that there was a moment in February 2007 when one man owned 590 of them, and that he let them go at the exact moment the world was willing to pay the most. He did not build monuments. He did not name buildings after himself. He bought what others had abandoned, held it until the world remembered its value, and sold it to the next person willing to believe. The buildings are still standing. The rents are still collected. The grave dancer is gone, but the dance, the specific, calculated, unsentimental rhythm of buying fear and selling confidence, is the oldest move in capitalism. He just did it better than almost anyone, and worse than he should have. And both of those facts are the truth.